Hi everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the 2016 Civil Liberties Award of the Ontario Civil Liberties Association, and we call it the OCLA for short. And my name is Joseph Hickey. I'm the Executive Director of the OCLA. So I hope you had a chance to help yourself to some coffee and cookies outside. And as you know, our award recipient this evening is Dr. Bruce Allan Clark. He's right here. And he has been a wonderful champion of Indigenous Canadian rights throughout his career, and he has paid a steep price for his bravery and conviction to basic moral and legal principles. And we're going to hear a lot more about Bruce's work and his story very shortly. So I want to just tell you the format for tonight's event. I'll quickly say a few words about what the OCLA is. And then following that, Mr. John Schaefer, who's a longtime friend of Dr. Clark's, was intending to be here tonight and travel from Toronto, but unfortunately he came down with a nasty flu bug. And so he did prepare comments, and he asked for those to be read. So I'll do that. And I've done a bit of work looking into the context of his comments and the sources that he quotes from, so I'll try my best to convey what John had to say. Then following that, Chief Gary Metallic, who's here up on the stage, is a friend and former client of Bruce's. And so he has traveled from the unceded Restigouche River basin on the Gaspe Peninsula, and he'll come up and give us an introduction about Bruce Clark. Then Bruce will come up and give his acceptance speech. And finally, Margaret, Bruce's wife, would like to say a few words about Bruce's professional and personal struggle and the struggles that they've both gone through over the years in their battles for justice. And following these speakers, we'd like to open things up for questions and discussion if people are in the mood for that. So we'll see what happens there, and so have your questions in mind for the end. So very briefly, for those who don't already know, the OCLA is an independent, entirely volunteer-run rights and freedoms organization. We were formed in early 2013. And since that time, we've taken many positions and written letters to officials, been quoted in the media about civil liberties issues, and we've hosted events like this one. This is our fourth award event, and the previous awards went to Mr. Harry Capito, Ms. Terry Jean Bedford, and Mrs. Connie Fournier. So we are all volunteers. We have no paid staff. And we're always happy to accept donations, and so there's a box for that on the table. We also have an email list, so for those of you who are new, please sign up for that. You can keep in touch and learn about our work and our events. And I also want to mention that we produced a 1-hour YouTube video interview with Bruce Clark last winter, and it's a really great, comprehensive document of Bruce's story and legal arguments, and so that's up on YouTube. You can find that if you go to the OCLA's YouTube channel, and there's a link to that on our webpage, which is ocla.ca. And so you can take a look at that later if you're interested. So, as I said, we're going to hear a lot about Bruce Clark's story. But what I want to say on behalf of the OCLA is that Dr. Clark is so remarkable and so worthy of our attention and our admiration because he is the person who took on great personal and professional risk to advance a legal argument that goes to the core of Canada's identity. And it's that Canada's violation of Aboriginal rights is unconstitutional, so that it breaks Canada's own constitution. And so Bruce Clark did his PhD in jurisprudence on this legal history, and it stems from the foundation of Canada and of British North America in the 1700s. And he took this knowledge and this research, and he represented Indigenous tribes in Canada in Canada's courts, arguing for their rights. So he rigorously and repeatedly brought forward this legal argument at all levels of court in our country, and they refused to hear it at every step of the way. And so the result is that we can now say that this has been done. Bruce Clark put it to the legal system, the unconstitutionality of Canada's treatment of Aboriginal rights. So he put it to Canada's judges and to Canada's legal community. And he did everything he could to obtain justice from Canada's courts. And so this is an incredible service that we must not forget. And on this basis, we're very pleased to hold this event tonight to honor Bruce's incredible work and his story.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name it's starting, Joe. My name is Gary Metallic Sr. I'm the 7th District Mi'kmaq Tribal Chief. I'm honored to be here tonight to honor and introduce Dr. Bruce Allan Clark, my dear friend and confidant. But first, I would like to thank the Ontario Civil Liberties Association, host Dennis Rancourt, Joseph Hickey, and co-sponsor Aboriginal Resource Centre for inviting me to this momentous event in recognizing Dr. Clark's work in having the courts address the pure jurisdictional law that affirms we as Indigenous nations. We are still Indigenous nations and still hold original titles to our still unceded lands. I and my wife Deborah and Sherry, who is from my community, are truly honored to be here at Dr. Clark's award event. I have to share with you that as I began writing my tribute and introduction of Dr. Clark, my daughter's eldest daughter asked me what I was writing. I told her I was asked to introduce and speak about a good friend of mine at the Ontario Civil Liberties Association. She then asked, "Is he dead?" I said, no. He's still alive. But I was almost tempted to tell her, well, might as well have killed him because of what they did to him, and John Schaefer had spoke about what happened to him when he defied the courts, and I guess when he exposed the great fraud that was being used in collaboration with the politicians. I told her also that Dr. Clark was an international and constitutional lawyer. Her spontaneous reply was, "Oh my God, you should be honored," which I replied, "Yes, indeed I am," to come here and honor Bruce tonight. And my wife and daughter were sitting in the living room, and I told them that, I looked up to them and I said, I never expected in a million years that I would be invited by the Ontario Civil Liberties Association to pay tribute and honor a man who many of our people consider a genius when it comes to arguing and defending Indian sovereignty. And I can attest to that. I've worked with Bruce over 2 decades. At times I too was on the receiving end of the judges. Bruce always told me, don't worry, you're an Indian, they're not going to throw you in jail like they did to me. I said, are you sure, Bruce? But he was right. He was right. He always said that, as a victim, no judge is going to do what they did to Bruce as a lawyer. And, I never thought I'd see the day when I can stand before a judge and tell that judge respectfully, Your Honor, I too am a judge in my nation. And as a tribal chief, I'm a judge of my nation. I may not wear the robe as you do, but that is my function. And to my surprise, he respected that. So I thank you, my friend, in giving me that courage to do so. I learned a lot from, working with Bruce. And I want to thank the Ontario Civil Liberties Association for including me to take part in this special event, which I believe has long been overdue. In 1992, I was first introduced to Dr. Clark's legal opinions regarding Indian sovereignty versus illegal colonization. I remember my specific land claims researcher handing me a book titled Native Liberty, Crown Sovereignty, authored by Dr. Clark. She said, looking at me over her reading glasses and saying, make sure you read it. I know what she meant, that I just not lay it down on one of the office shelves and collect dust. So I took her advice and I started reading it, and I couldn't put it down. Went through it in no time, because chapter after chapter described in great detail throughout history how the judicial and political institutions collaborated together in evading the rule of law and creating their laws to illegally take over our homelands and abolish our life hereditary ancestral governing systems throughout our territories, and replacing them with their 1876 federally legislated Indian Act Band Councils. And at around this time, I was elected as a councillor of the Indian Act Band Council system. You might ask, well, why would I run in that system, being a traditional tribal representative of my district? Well, we did that to, I guess, get control of the termination and extinguishment negotiations that were going on between Canada and their federally created band councils. We weren't listened to when it came to trying to telling them that we mustn't go this route, because we're already original title holders of these territories, based on several arguments. 1763 Royal Proclamation. I said, why are we sitting with Canada in these termination and extinguishment processes when we're the original title holders? we should be sitting as equal partners. But Canada knew that, and there was no way they were going to accept our traditional tribal council to be part of these negotiations. So we ran in 1992 in the political system, and the majority of us got elected who were part of the traditional council system. And when we did get in, we managed to turn and switch the agenda in regards to Aboriginal and treaty rights, and our unceded land titles were concerned. But that didn't last long. And it was at this time that Dr. Clark and Margaret and David were invited to our community. I finally located Dr. Clark after reading this book. And I said to myself and my colleagues, we have to find this lawyer, because what he's talking about is what our ancestors have been saying, and what our grandfathers and fathers have been saying. So we located him in New York State that time. And through a phone call, I asked Dr. Clark if he would come and work with us in reasserting our jurisdictions, in reoccupying our territories. He, Margaret, and David came with us and lived with us for, I believe it was a year or something, right?
At least.
Yeah. They lived in a nice, quaint cottage up in the woods. Yeah. And so we got to work on issues that we were faced with. And at that time, it was about two twins that were, their mother had married in the United States and California. And the marriage didn't last, too long, maybe about 7 or 8 years. And the mother, after facing abuse from the husband, decided to move back to the reservation with her children. Of course, the husband didn't agree with that, and he, of course, said she was kidnapping her daughters. To make a long story short, she came to our reservation and asked for from our traditional tribal council for protection, asylum, and protection of her children. And it was through Dr. Clark that we learned that we did indeed, as the original tribal systems, have that jurisdiction to provide that. And the necessary legal documents were filed within the Quebec court system. And the province and the courts couldn't do anything. They realized that they couldn't penetrate the sovereignty, the Indian sovereignty that was asserted by our people. So for that, we're grateful too. We had hired a legal firm from Montreal who specialized in constitutional law just before Bruce arrived in our community, and it was about several days or a week maybe. And I had asked the senior partner in that firm his opinion about Bruce's book, Native Liberty and Crown Sovereignty. I expected that he would have a positive opinion, about Bruce's pure legal jurisdictional arguments. But to my surprise, instead, he said, Dr. Clark should not be listened to. And he said, this is a lawyer. His words were, this is a lawyer that has gone mad. Those were his exact words. I told him I beg to differ. I think he's just a lawyer who was mad at what the courts were doing to our people. And needless to say, well, that was his last day of work with us. And I was hoping that he could work with Dr. Clark, but I knew right away it was like oil and water. He was an officer of the Crown. I realized then that he was an officer of the Crown, and he wasn't willing to cross that line as Dr. Clark did. When he stood before the judges and exposed them in what they were doing, turning a blind eye and creating their own judge-made law to justify the taking of our territories and our rights in many ways. And for that, he paid a terrible price, as you pointed out, Joseph and John. And not only Bruce, but Margaret and the family paid a terrible price. And when I think about 2 decades and some years later, last year or a year before, I read a statement by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, Beverly what's her name? McLaughlin, who publicly stated that Canada did indeed commit cultural genocide against the Aboriginal people. And she was talking about the residential schools and the treatment, of the children. And then it was later before that, Paul Martin, the Prime Minister of Canada, also, admitted to the cultural genocide. But when Bruce talked about that, or when he mentioned that to the judges, they raked him over the coals. So, I'm glad that tonight he's being vindicated for just trying to help our people. And I'm glad to be part of this. I want to also talk about the video that was mentioned earlier, the interview with Dr. Clark past winter. I watched it. And it was a very moving interview. And I'd like to share the words from Dr. Clark in regards to the residential schools and what happened to the children, to our children, when they were taken away from their parents and families. By these children being taken away, he says, it destroyed the reason for being of the Indian lifestyle, which was to take the children into the bush, into the hinterland. There they would learn the skills of hunting and trapping, and also the mystical experience of understanding the language of the animals, and also the spirit world. If you completely destroy the family by robbing the children, you also completely collapse their economy. And parents of the residential children fell into a state of depression and turned to alcohol and drank to forget. Their children were not there anymore. Their laughter gone. So they drank and they cried. And many committed suicide. When the survivors of the residential schools returned to their homes on the reservations, they never experienced a family life or traditions. Many were abused in unthinkable ways and were broken physically and spiritually. And many never made it back home. The residential school's mandate in trying to take the Indian out of the child was almost successful and almost fulfilled Sir John A. Macdonald's vision of ridding Canada of the Indian problem. That would have been seen as the final solution, but they failed. We survived colonization and assimilation. And these are my words. These last paragraph are my words. But I spoke to Dr. Clark and Margaret earlier before when I just arrived here in regards to the disconnect that happened because these children were taken away by their families and their communities. We in my community are building what we call a lodge for ceremonial cultural purposes. And we're building it within our ancestral territory where my great-grandfathers hunted and took their families up there. And this was before the residential school era. And this is how they took their children up there so that they could relate or connect to Mother Earth and that how they could survive, from her resources. And when I was watching that video, that hit home for me. And we started this 3 weeks ago. I didn't know about the tribute until Joseph and Dennis notified me through email. But this is exactly what we're doing. We're going to take our children up there. And we're going to teach them. We're going to teach them who they are. Not only to survive and live off the land, but also to survive Canada's colonial and current extinguishment and assimilation policies, which are still ongoing. And it's sad to say, I thought that maybe the Liberal government under Justin Trudeau would make a reversal, but that didn't happen. I think Justin Trudeau just slipped on Harper's slippers, emperor's slippers, and you could see that in approvals of pipelines in BC, promoting the oil and gas industry. But we're also going to teach these children at that lodge about Bruce Clark's works. We're going to start them off young. I started late. I was 40-some years old when I read his book. I wish I was about 20 years old when I read his book. I could have accomplished much more than what I was able to, as a leader of my community. I probably would have went back to school and even took law, but all was not a lost cause. We did a lot when you were in my community. We did a lot and we learned a lot. And for that, we'll always be grateful, eternally grateful. And when Bruce talks about, he had mentioned in his video about the question never being addressed, or the question never being brought forward to the judges again in their courts, because they made sure that they got rid of him. They disbarred him, and they made sure that he wasn't coming back to ever pose that question again on the pure jurisdictional law that affirmed we were, as Indigenous people, nations, and that we were and we are the original title holders. But I can stand here before you tonight, and you, Bruce, and I've always told you, as long as I'm alive, that message is going to spread. And that's what I've been doing over 2 decades. And it was not in vain, because I know a lot of young people who have read your books and were struck the same way as I was. Everything just opens up. It's as clear as day. So this is what we're going to do. I'm going to need all your documents someday. And I think you had told me that one day you were going to transfer those so that I could have people like Sherry, who's studied political science, but who knows, may further go on to be, our Bruce Clark. So far, through her actions, she's been acting, as an activist, so who knows? So I'm going to ask Sherry, before I introduce my dear friend, to come up and speak. I want her to come up because she has an eagle feather that she wants to present to Bruce. And for us, the eagle feather, or the eagle itself, now has always been a symbol and has been deeply respected by all indigenous peoples throughout North America. And it is because of its strength and vision and tenacity to survive. Bruce, as a constitutional international lawyer, he was the only lawyer in Canada who dared cross the line the judicial drew, that if their fraudulent ways were uncovered, that lawyer exposing that fraud would pay dearly for doing so. That was Dr. Clark. They stripped him of his right to be a lawyer, but for our people, he is still our legal eagle. Because he dared to soar where only eagles dare to soar. Thank you, Doctor. I introduce to you my friend, my dear friend, Dr. Bruce Clark.
I just want to explain, this was given to me many years ago. And as First Nations people, the eagle feather is not ours to keep. And tonight it's my turn to pass it on to Bruce Clark. And it's such an honor that, because for everything that he's done in his life, everything he has done for our people, which is also the Mi'kmaq nations, where I come from, where Gary comes from, and I'm an activist. I stand front lines everywhere, and my mom always said, you're going to go to jail, you're going to die. But as long as I carry this, I'm not going to die, I'm not going to end up in jail, and if I do, it's for the right cause. It's because there's not too many of us that will stand up for our people, and I always believe you're sent somewhere for a reason. And in a million years, I have never thought I would be here in Ottawa. And I'm here now, and there's a reason why I'm here. I never told Gary yet. I was working with another organization, and I was actually asked if I can work at AFN. And that's where I am now, and there's a reason why I'm there. I don't want to say that yet. So you have to work inside to understand what goes on in politicians' heads, and that was my major in university. I just actually graduated in May, and I majored in political science, but because it was the criminal side of it, like I learned the Constitution, the Human Rights Act, and our treaties, and I actually educated students within our class because there were non-Native students that didn't know about residential school, and they used to not believe me that it did exist until the professor actually showed it the YouTube, and the students were crying, like they thought, like to say that we thought you were a liar, it never happened, and it was hard. And so now I'm up the hill from here, and like I said, there's a reason why I'm quiet there for now. I always go that way, and then I will strike out, but that's where, I'm going to get what I need to get. And through all these politicians that are out there, are our own politicians, First Nations, which follow the Indian Act, which I do not follow. I also sit with Gary at home and his wife Deborah at our meetings. I'm there, and so there's a reason why I'm here, and it's an honor tonight to be here. And so with this eagle feather, it's my turn to give it up because it's going to a good person. And I present this to you, Bruce, because of everything you've done in your life and what you have done for people, and more things will come to you. So this is, look, it's even shaking. But I honor you with this because you did honor our people, you respected our people, you acknowledged our people, you trust our people, and Gary trusted you, and he brought us to our community, and you saw our people there, and you actually helped us out. And I just got to meet you because of Gary. I haven't read all your stuff yet, but eventually I will. And who knows, I might be sitting up with Trudeau next week up the hill there. and not walking in, what's his name, slippers. So I honor you this, and with the most utmost respect.
Thank you, Sheriff.
And I have the case here.
Aboriginal rights, justice, the rule of law, each forsaken. The first principle of the rule of law in a constitutional democracy is constitutional supremacy. When in conflict with federal or provincial legislation, constitutional legislation is paramount and the other legislation is void. Most determinatively, Section 109 of the Constitution Act 1867 enacts that provincial crown land remains subject to the Indian interest in such land as remains unceded by the Indians to the Crown by nation-to-nation treaty, such as British Columbia, the Ottawa Drainage Basin, and Eastern Canada. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 is constitutional legislation. It enacts the Indian nations live under our, quote, protection, end quote, and may not be, quote, molested or disturbed, end quote, in the possession of any land whatever that has not been ceded by them to their trustee, now the federal government. Crown patents of unceded land made upon any pretense expressly are forbidden. This paramountcy of the Indian unceded constitutional interest over provincial land statutes is confirmed by the two leading Aboriginal rights law precedents, St. Catharines Milling and Lumber Company Limited versus the Queen in 1888 in the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, and secondly, Attorney General Ontario versus Attorney General Canada in re Indian Claims in 1897, also in the Judicial Committee. At the time, the Judicial Committee was the highest court of appeal in the British Empire, over and above the Supreme Court of Canada. The problem is that the Canadian courts arbitrarily reject every case which is based upon the paramountcy of the proclamation's constitutional force over provincial land patents. The statutory test for granting leave to appeal to the Supreme Court is whether the Constitution, or rather the question of law, is of public importance. No constitutional question can be as critical as the competition between provincial land granting statutes and the Constitutional Royal Proclamation of 1763 and Section 109. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court consistently and repeatedly denies leave to appeal to address this particular constitutional question. The Supreme Court itself is situate upon unceded Indian land. For this reason, the rule of law is thwarted. Mere provincial legislation is given paramountcy over the constitutional proclamation. The first principle of the rule of law, constitutional supremacy, knowingly has been negated by the courts acting in concert. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his essay on character, wrote, "Truth is the summit of being. Justice is the application of it to affairs." The legal truth is that the settled constitutional Aboriginal right is the power of veto over provincial development of Crown land based upon the Royal Proclamation of 1763, Section 109 of the Constitution Act 1867, and the leading precedents, St. Catharines Milling 1888 and In re Indian Claims 1897. The lie recently invented by the Supreme Court of Canada in willful blindness is that the Aboriginal right is no more than the right to be consulted. There's a long list of cases, modern cases, to this, reiterating this principle that it is restricted to the right to be consulted. And each of these was in the Supreme Court of Canada. The court did not address Section 109 and Indian national sovereignty. Insofar as legal justice consists in the application of truth to affairs, justice, like the rule of law, has also been forsaken. The courts adopted the political principle laid down by Canada's Attorney General Edward Blake in 1875. The idea that since, quote, great inconvenience and confusion might result from disallowing, end quote, the British Columbia land legislation, the Indian settled constitutional power of veto should be ignored. The history leading to the unconstitutional political power in effect to repeal the Constitution, where obeying it would be politically inconvenient and confusing, began in 1874. Then British Columbia enacted a Crown Lands Act that regarded all Crown land, including land not yet ceded to or purchased by the Crown from the Indians, as being free and clear of any Indian interest within the meaning of Section 109 of the Constitution Act 1867. In other words, the British Columbia Statute proclaimed a tacit repeal of the Proclamation of 1763 as well as Section 109. In response, upon the recommendation of Canada's Attorney General Telesphore Fournier, the Canadian Privy Council enacted an order in council in 1875 disallowing the British Columbia Statute, which the Governor General duly did later in that year. Then, Fournier was appointed to the Supreme Court and replaced as Attorney General by Blake. British Columbia enacted a fresh Crown Lands Act, still in 1875, which new act repeated the ignoring of the constitutionally paramount Indian interest. Blake persuaded the cabinet not to disallow this new act. He explained to the Governor General the reason was, quote, great inconvenience and confusion might result from its disallowance, end quote. The Governor General went along with this ascendancy of political expediency over constitutional supremacy and neglected to disallow the Fresh Land Act. The judicial evasion of the rule of law and justice had an early beginning, being masterminded by the judiciary of Canada in the quest for nation building. John Elmsley, Chief Justice of Upper Canada, in a report to the Executive Council of Upper Canada dated October 22nd, 1798, recommended as follows. It is no secret to any person at all acquainted with the present state of Indian affairs that the Aborigines of this part of His Majesty's American dominions are beginning to appreciate their lands, not so much by the use which they themselves make of them, as by the value at which they are estimated by those who purchase them and either cultivate them or dispose of them in their natural state. It is equally notorious that if the Indians wanted penetration to make the discovery, there are a great many persons of European origin who have attached themselves to the several tribes which surround us, and will not fail to inform them that the value of any article depends as much upon its importance to the purchaser as on its usefulness to the present possessors. But if this were doubtful now, when the lands purchased from the Indians are distributed among His Majesty's subjects at a fee hardly exceeding the prime cost of them, it cannot possibly remain so when the Indians discover, as they unquestionably will, that the purchases made from them are to be converted into a source of revenue to ourselves. Slow as their progress is towards civilization, they are perfectly apprised of the value of money and of its use in maintaining them in those habits of indolence and intemperance to which most of them are more or less inclined. In order, therefore, to exercise that foresight which our Indian neighbors are beginning to learn, and in which certainly cannot be our interest to promote their improvement, we submit for your honor's consideration the propriety of suspending the promulgation of the plan which has been laid down for us until we can make a sufficiently large purchase to secure for us the means of extending the population and increasing the strength of the provinces so far as to enable us, before our stock is exhausted, to dictate instead of soliciting the terms on which future acquisitions are to be made." End quote. The Chief Justice in 1798 thus laid down a formula for evading the fiduciary duty of the legislature. Rather than the protection, the formula was not how better to protect, but rather how better to defraud. Upon this basis, Attorney General Blake engineered the enactment of the first Indian Act in 1876, inventing municipal Indian governments subject to federal and provincial laws of general application, even on unceded Indian land, thereby in intent and effect abolishing the quasi-sovereign several nations or tribes. This was accompanied by a century of Indian residential schools that kidnapped the Indian children from age 4 to age 16 and all but destroyed the Indian languages and economies. In every generation, more and more molestations and disturbances under federal and provincial law were heaped upon the native culture in an unrelenting, unconstitutional, genocidal ethnic cleansing. That was the simple plan from then until now. Now is the time to right that wrong.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And Margaret, if you'd like to say a few words.
First, I'd like to thank Gary for his kind words and his acknowledgement of the depth that Bruce has and that he's willing to share. Gary is a rare, rare human who is willing to listen and really listen, think, ask questions, and then absorb what he's heard. Thank you, Gary. And Deborah. Deborah and I know that there's always a good woman behind every successful man, right, Deborah? Thank you, Peter and Denis and Joseph, for creating this event. The award means a great deal to our family. Our almost 8-year-old granddaughter, Eva Rose, is so proud of her Baba that she wrote about him for her grade 3 class. In the 40 years that Bruce and I have lived and worked together, there have been many challenges which Bruce always met with courage in the honest belief that the rule of law meant something. Perhaps the most difficult challenge has been retirement. Not only has his belief been shattered, but a disbarred lawyer is tarred with a very dark brush. He had tried every available venue across Canada and in Europe on behalf of his clients. We had judges come up to us after denying a court hearing and encouraging us to keep trying, but just not in his courtroom. And each time that he had to go to court, he had the hope that maybe this time his client's argument would be addressed. Eventually, he gave me the car keys before we entered the courtroom, just in case. His work was never addressed, to be acted upon or shown with specific legal reasons to be in error. And still his former clients suffer from the court's denial of justice. That is a heavy burden for Bruce to bear, especially when he's seen some of the best and brightest young men we've known commit suicide in despair. Bruce and I want to thank our family for their patience and support throughout the ups and downs of our life's path. Our eldest son, David, who is here with his wife, Val, traveled with us and became our resident computer expert. Our daughter, Zoe, is here with her co-partner, Dave, her tall and handsome grandson, Jacob, and a wonderful Eva Rose. Zoe decided on her own when she was 16 that she simply couldn't bear the uncertainties and multiple moves and stayed alone or with friends in Ottawa. She survived with dignity some very challenging years, but on her own terms. She eventually found the perfect 8-unit apartment close to the Rideau River, and her home became our safe haven, a place to which we could go when all was bleak. Now Bruce and I also live in a bachelor apartment in the same building and have the luxury of being a natural part of our grandchildren's lives. Our youngest grandson just turned 3. Adrian is our son Beau's beautiful son, and Beau also lives in the same apartment building. Beau left us early on as well, and he too survived with dignity in some pretty unique environments. I sure do wish the Facebook was around back then, I think. I'm not sure. Not to be forgotten are my parents, Bill and Lucy Book, now 97 and 95. They were our safety nets those few times we were completely stranded. They didn't understand our life path, but they were there for us when we needed them. Thank you, Gary and Deborah, for being here tonight. Your genuine friendship means a great deal to us. And John Schaefer's words and thoughts are much appreciated, and he, like Gary, is a genuine friend. Now it's time to open the floor to questions for Bruce. Thank you.
Let's just have another big round of applause for Bruce.